David Longwelder. Welcome back to the Village podcast. So this
Thank
is
you.
the second part in a series on law and literature, in which you mean to delve into the Renaissance, High Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. Can you take it away?
Well, I mean, I was just two things. I've been judging debates for the English Speaking Union, and they asked me, would I judge their Shakespeare debates, which is when they get these school children to recite from Shakespeare and then comment on it. And
Mhm.
of course, the thought did occur to me that it's like the lodestar or the platinum chip standard when you deal with literature as a concept to go back to Shakespeare and what he had to say about lawyers. Now, the first interesting observation, I think, is
Mhm.
that many people thought Shakespeare was a lawyer. And it's something I'll deal with later, that the legendary Francis Bacon, who was also a great essayist and writer and a scientist, he also was the first King's or Queen's Counsel in Britain. He was the Attorney General of Britain. And as well as that, he became Lord Chancellor. But there's a huge school of opinion that think Francis Bacon was really William Shakespeare.
Right.
And because Francis Bacon was so posh and upper class, he didn't want to allow people to know that he was William Shakespeare. Now, this theory, which has been adopted by such as Mark Twain, and there's a division of people who say it's either Stratford or Bacon, has been discredited. So we can say that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, but equally we can say with certainty that Shakespeare was or was not a lawyer. Or certainly he has a huge understanding of law. I suppose the first play you go to is Measure for Measure, which is all about law. It's not one of its
Mhm.
most famous plays, but the
Uh-huh.
Duke of Vienna leaves Vienna and he leaves it in the hands of what might be called a religious fundamentalist,
Yeah.
who then starts cracking down on fornication and sentence Angelo to death for getting a woman pregnant. That's the kind of engine of the plot. But the Duke hasn't left Vienna. It's hideously complicated. He's there as a watcher all of the time as events unfold. And what the play is about is that you cannot enforce excessive moralism in the law, that law should be distinct from morality. This has
Mhm.
become a very topical debate in the 1950s in philosophical terms between Lord Devlin and H.L.A. Hart, both of whom Devlin was a judge, but he was also a legal writer and Hart was a legal philosopher, and as to whether and to what extent the law should enforce a common morality. And of course, that's an issue in extreme countries today with Sharia law or the enforcement of fundamentalist things in America, such as the cracking down on books and the banning of books, and also the censoring of people's private lives and private contact. And through
Mhm.
Shakespeare, through the voice of the Duke of Vienna, we have Shakespeare saying, no, moderation is crucial.
Mhm.
And moderation is the most important thing in terms of how a just or wise ruler runs a country. And that law must not be a terror. It's a crucial aspect of Measure for Measure. And there's a famous line, we must not make a scarecrow of the law, but by the religious fundamentalist who's left in charge. And that is, of course, completely contrary to the Duke of Vienna's attitude. Law must not be a terror. Law must be a source of moderation. And also authority must be legitimately questioned. Now, to summarize the entire plot would be hugely complicated, but in effect, the Duke of Vienna resumes his remit, takes control of the situation, pardons in a merciful way. We'll come back to the mercy issue. The incumbent ruler pardons Angelo, the falsely, or not falsely accused, but pardons him from the death sentence, and has a just dispensation of everybody. And the sense is that the good lawyer must be a point Lord Sumption has made, or the great lawyer must be an ifs and buts person, a sense of moderation, a sense of balance, and a sense of proportion. Now, I don't think Measure for Measure is a great play, but it's about law. The one everybody associates with Shakespeare and law is the hugely controversial Merchant of Venice. And even as we start discussing it now, Luke, one is conscious of the events in Ireland and around the world recently.
The Elizabethans had to live with this constant overhanging fear of a regime change, religious orthodoxy, and changes in the monarch.
Yes,
That
they
would make
did.
you aware of the make you aware of the law, and the kind of vagaries of the justice system.
Yes, and they also had to live with very precarious. Shakespeare was a businessman, very
Yeah,
precarious fiscal arrangements, let's put it like that, as
yeah.
well as suppression. And leaving aside the Merchant of Venice for a second, Shakespeare shows incredible knowledge of land law, fee farm grants, fee simples, leasehold arrangements. He understands the concepts of battery and assault.
Mhm,
The whole structure of all of the plays is littered with examples of legal expression. Hamlet's famous speech, which is often at the graveyard, often purely associated with the "Alas, pure Yorick, I knew him well," is also addressing a lawyer. This skull was a lawyer's. Where are all his quidities and legal arguments now? I mean,
yeah.
you could pause almost any Shakespeare play and you could see a huge amount of law, legal vernacular. But Measure for Measure and Merchant of Venice. Let's approach Merchant of Venice gingerly, shall we? For
Mhm,
those that don't know, the play is about a man called Antonio who gets in debt with a Jewish moneylender called Shylock, and he can't repay the debt through the complications of his relationship with Bassonia and so on.
mhm,
And Shylock seeks the enforcement of his bond, the forfeiture of his bond, which is, of course, a line in the play and is also a legal expression that I use an illegal concept in, say, proceeds of crime litigation or commercial litigation, which is frequently in use today. Forfeiture is also an order in the criminal court when they order the destruction, say, of certain types of illegally seized assets, such as drugs.
mhm,
And he wants the forfeiture of his bond. But the bond is about, if you don't pay me the money back crudely, I want a pound of your flesh. There is very strong lines explaining Shylock's motivation, and it's tribal, and the word tribe is used by Shylock. I'll do a
mhm,
disservice to my tribe if I don't
mm,
forfeit this bond.
mm,
Of course, tribalism is now a worldwide phenomenon as we show tribalistic attitudes, not least, I should say, in Ireland recently, towards the Jewish community in the proposed renaming of Herzog Park, which unsettles me greatly. And in any event, we have a whole complex dynamic that comes from all of this. Enter Portia, the great feminist hero, pleading for mercy for Antonio. And just as you alluded, Luke, earlier, to the complex nature of Elizabethan instability in terms of regimes and the sense of the omnipresence of the law or the omnipresence of being arrested. There is also the utilization of a concept that is Elizabethan but can be transliterated to a different concept. It's called mercy. And of course, Portia's famous speech in Merchant from Venice, pleading for mercy, means pleading for justice.
mhm,
Do a little wrong to achieve a greater good is a famous line in the play. And sometimes I think the message for that for lawyers must be, quote, attributed to Shakespeare, but not his. The law's an ass. And
mhm,
sometimes a judge has to look at the justice of the case, bend the rules. The legendary jurist Ronald Dworkin said, in the context of apartheid South Africa, sometimes the judge may have an obligation to lie
yeah,
about what the law
mm,
means. And I kind of agree with that because if you've passed stuff that's totally immoral, totally disproportionate, then the creativity of lawyers marked by a sense of justice and the Elizabethan concept of mercy
mhm.
through Portia is the same as the concept of justice.
Do you think her name might be a play on the word proportional?
An interesting call. I've never heard that before. I must say I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying
It's a
it
little bit
might be
close.
that.
A little bit close.
Yeah, yeah. It
And the
seems to me
pound
that
of flesh and the measure for measure, it's just arranged like these ideas of proportionality of what punishment equals and what debt equals what payment
well,
equals what debt.
exactly. And
Yeah,
Measure
yeah.
for Measure, the title of the previous play is about balance. It's
Right,
about
right.
not overreacting and
Yeah.
coming to the sensible conclusion. So there's huge amounts of wisdom there. But of course, And there are other things that are often quoted about Shakespeare. There's the famous sideline quote of Dick the Butcher in Henry VI, which is a tribute to him. Let's kill all the lawyers, but not necessarily endorsed by him, of course. And certainly there was a strong sense of the repudiation of what might be called literalism, the strict enforcement of my bond, by the overarching. Although, having said that, Portia relies on literal legal interpretation or plea to have the bond in effect revoked by saying, well, you can't have a pound of flesh without a shedding Christian blood. And we
Mm.
must confront the Gorgon's head here. The play is anti Semitic, no doubt about it whatsoever. And it is hugely controversial. And in these very fraught times, anti Semitism has resurfaced and is a plague of our times. But having said that, everybody is a creature of their time. And you've got, of course, the comments from Harold Bloom and everybody about Shakespeare and the dangers of interpolating the portrayal of racism as, in fact, the endorsement of racism. Now, it's most interesting that Shakespeare, and I had to look at this very carefully in the last couple of days
Mhm.
because it's an extraordinary thing. There's a book, let me just do a brief digression. There's a book by David McCullough on John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. And John Adams died the same time as his great rival, adversary, and friend, Thomas Jefferson, the
Mhm.
exact same day. And it was 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. And
Mhm.
it is said, though Adams was factually wrong, John Adams' last expression in life was Thomas Jefferson lives, even though
Right.
Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. And
Right.
the extraordinary thing is, just as Shakespeare ushers in the theatre as we know it today, and is the greatest dramatist of all time, and one of the greatest poets, certainly the sonnets, on the
Mm.
same day Shakespeare died,
Mhm.
Cervantes dies in Spain.
Yes, yes.
And Cervantes is, of course, the founder of the novel. There's no question about
Mm.
the novel as an art form is Don Quixote.
Mm.
That's where it begins. If we go back to Shakespeare as this treasure trove of knowledge, of morality, of human nature, of analysis, and of law,
Mhm.
then if you go back to the seminal book of all time, it's Don Quixote. And they
Mhm.
died the same day. You got to believe in as fools to wanton are we to the gods, which is another Shakespeare quote in a different context. You've
Mhm.
got to believe that they may be playing some game with us when you hear something like that.
I think it's funny that those 2 Venice plays, I don't know if there are other ones, The Merchant of Venice, but also Othello, they both feature these kind of, the 2 big religious outgroups of the obviously medieval times and the Renaissance times, the Muslim war
Yeah.
and the Jew and
The
Venice
dark
being
satanic outsider, the
created
demonization structure. Yeah.
and how they are shown to be working on their own advancement and survival and things like this and using what tactics they have. And I was pointing out the hypocrisy of those around them who want to sort of, suppress them, not just for what they say and do, but for like who they are. And that seems natural.
What I was just saying was, of course, was that Cervantes and Shakespeare died the same day. But just back briefly to a point about Francis Bacon.
Right.
Bacon was Shakespeare's exact contemporary. And of course, you've made the point about how precarious the Elizabethan court was in terms of instability and authority. Bacon was the first Queen's Counsel, the Attorney General, and then the Lord Chancellor. Now, he did outlive Shakespeare and was ultimately forced to resign for corruption. He also, just as an aside, was particularly in his essays and in his legal writing, was extremely influential in the development of legal concepts. He was a great scientist. He's the founder, arguably, of empiricism.
Yeah.
But he was the person who effectively was responsible for the concept of precedent in the law and
Hmm.
also, or the development of precedent.
Wow, that's an extraordinary thing to be responsible for.
Well, it is indeed. It's not something Dr. Johnson, will come to him, liked him for, but he looked at previous case law to get from them patterns of reasoning and precedent. And in fairness, he was also what modern lawyers call the necessity to avoid legalese, which is also very important and a criticism Swift makes of lawyers, among others. Emphasis on clarity. on simplicity, and
Mm.
also, in fairness to Bacon, trying to make law a protector of the little man. One of the reasons, just final point in this, that this conspiracy theory that Bacon was Shakespeare was when Bacon was effectively master of the lutes. They call it master of the masked ball in Gray's Inns, of which I'm a graduate. It was the very first performance of A Comedy of Errors in
Okay.
Gray's Inns. So that's one of the things that let the ball rolling. But the point I was making was the novel comes in with the very strange man, Cervantes. And of course, in the last podcast, you brought up with me that Dostoevsky had served prison time in Siberia 4 years. So did Cervantes on several occasions.
And he was a slave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course he's under pain of arrest in Don Quixote because he rescues slaves.
Uh-huh.
That's the major it's an arrest warrant set out for him because he objects to the way the galley slaves are being treated. He's drawing a distinction which I think is as subversively interesting today as it was then in Don Quixote between the law of the state, which was held in a certain degree of contempt, and the ancient rule of chivalry. He's like
Mm.
a one-man justice machine, knight errant. And if one thinks of the great image of the book, immortalized in Jacques Brel's film, of course, it's about windmills and his tilting at them, even though he doesn't really understand what a windmill is. But of course, tilting at windmills, in a way, is a phrase that has entered the lingo and the vernacular as somebody obsessed with causes and lost causes and pursuing the impossible all of the time. But it's also something I think associated with miscarriages of justice.
Right.
And there's throughout Don Quixote a complete contempt for the obscenities and complications of the state law. But there's also exactly the point you made, the fragility of everything. That period of time, not just in England, but in Spain, was a time of seismic change.
Mm.
The replacement of old values, old folkways,
Mm.
with new state driven imperium. And Cervantes was a traditionalist and resisted that. And the second part of Don Quixote, his servant, Sancho Panzas, which is immortalized even in a song by the Stranglers. His serf is given a governorship by him or something like that, or of
Mhm.
his mysterious realm, and starts dispensing justice in the old way, in folk lore and folk driven, rather than following the edicts of the Spanish codes. So it's a tremendous thing about law and transition, about pursuing justice, even if it gets to the point of tilting at windmills and being. I mean, most of the great seismic changes in the law, Geoffrey Robertson made this point in his autobiography, the famous King's Counsel, head of Doughty Street Chambers. Come back to him in a second. Most of the major changes in the law have been made by rebels, renegades, idealists, and people who were just blockheaded.
John
Tilting
Brown,
at
there's
windmills.
some more than a little bit of Don Quixote to say John Brown, who triggered, the US Civil War because he was so abolitionist that he couldn't stir and couldn't move away from that towards anything else. That was absolutely what he was going to do. John Brown.
John Brown's body lies a moulding in its grave. It's the song of the time, I think. I mean, that's not necessarily a good. It's a good analogy, but not necessarily a good man. But
Mm.
there's no doubt that a lot of people who are mulish and pig-headed, sometimes you can get it wrong.
Yeah.
When we get to the next podcast, Miscarriage of Justice, there are examples of people who devote much of their life to what is a perceived miscarriage of justice, which wasn't. But that's a different day's
Wow.
work. Paul Foote, for example, the famous English and journalist with a great growl for Ireland, spent much of his career trying to get Hanratty exonerated. And ultimately, the Court of Appeal disagreed with him. And I think Hanratty probably did do it. I won't go into the dangerous waters of that yet, but I might in a later podcast. If we get to, I've deliberately skipped about 50 or 60 years. I mean, I think Bacon dies 20 or 10 years after Shakespeare.
Right.
And that period is the period of Puritanism.
Mhm.
I'd like to revisit it in a later podcast, the one I've just mentioned, The Miscarriage of Justice, because
Mhm.
much of that era of the Cromwell era, which I've written about, is about witch hunts.
Wow.
And of course, that's immortalized in Arthur Miller's Crucible.
Mm.
which we will deal with in the subsequent podcast. But
Mm.
none of that is really good. Where things pick up again is, of course, the Enlightenment. And I suppose we should start. There was a review of Conor Cruise O'Brien's biography of Edmund Burke, The Great Melody, which is a terrific book, saying it was the greatest book by the greatest living Irishman of the greatest Irishmen of all time.
Yes.
But I don't think that's true of Burke. I
Mm.
think it was Jonathan Swift. And Swift is the dominant figure, really, of the English Enlightenment. More so than the philosophers like Hume, more so than Dr. Johnson, who we'll mention. I mean, he's the preeminent writer of the age, more so than Dryden and Pope. And that was in England, even though he's Irish. Or is he? It's a
Or is
real
he?
complex. Yeah, well, exactly. I suppose that's why we'd. Well, he certainly said the most important thing ever about our country, I think. I mean, the greatest essay, in my view, in the English language is a modest proposal.
Mhm.
And it's certainly the greatest political essay ever written. It should be done to
Mhm.
voices. I'd love to do it like even me or someone like a Beckett player, or have someone like Michael Gambon read it out.
Mm.
And you can transliterate the text of it and apply it to Ireland today. You
Mm.
really could. I've had a go at that in Broadsheet a couple of years ago.
It's wild that it seems to have a stamp that works for different points in Irish history too. Obviously, the famine, which was 100 years
Yes.
after him.
But now, I mean, and his condemnation of the British was brave. It really was. He had been given titles by the British, including Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, minor from his point of view in context, and he had incurred a lot of controversy when he was in Britain. But nonetheless, it was a brave stance, and it was because of his overall humanity. But what
Mm.
the Brits
Mm.
were doing to
Mm.
us in the famine, or the absentee landlords, of course, is what the ruling class are doing to the plain people of Ireland today to a lesser extent. The whole, it's very difficult if someone doesn't have a proper educational base. I don't mean to be patronizing, to not understand the subtlety of the irony in a modest proposal.
Mm.
Effectively, the recommendation that it would be better to eat children and it would create profit is a defeat of greed.
Mm.
Satire of the wealth maximization cost benefit analysis, which intrudes on the accountants who run Ireland, the Trumpinistas,
Mm.
people like Richard Posner in wealth maximization. But the more overarching point is what it does is it shows that if you make the point Smith's making, which comes very clear towards the end of this magnificent essay, is that you've made their life hell on earth. And to a significant extent, with homelessness, housing rights, unaffordable rents and mortgages, that's what's happening today. Obviously not as graphic,
Mm.
but you're right about it. The essay flits in and out of Irish history. I've always felt it should be read by a great actor.
Mm.
Beckett did all these plays for voices,
Right.
and his famous play with Michael Gambon for radio as well was like that, had to be listened to.
Yes.
And he did several plays for radio. And Krapp's Last Tape works very well as a monologue in that way. I think somebody should read out a modest proposal and change some of the language to make it applicable to Ireland today.
Like this
But
quote from him where he, leaving a comment about his dedication of money to create the mental hospital, which is today St. Patrick's, which I know also is the place where people are treated for eating disorders, which is kind of a little bit redolent of the theme of the modest proposal in some ways, and of famines and of the lack or surplus of food and so on. But I love it when he says he gave the little wealth he had to build a house for fools and mad, and shout by one satiric touch, no nation wanted it so much. So it's both a kindness and a kind of a dig, which is very much like him.
I mean, the man was an absolute master of the English language. And what's on that famous thing again? What's great about it, a modest proposal, is you could honestly say that not a word of it, not a single word of it, is anything but accessible all these years later.
Right,
You know?
right, right.
It's beautifully, simply written. But of course, it's not the crux of his comments on lawyers.
Hmm.
Most people who know Swift know Gulliver's Travels, and most people have only read for children or in children's versions, Lilliput section. But that's not where he goes into lawyers. It's extraordinary. And I read it recently.
Hmm.
The fourth book of Gulliver is he's on this land run by horses. and he's trying to explain to the horses how humans are dirty, filthy, awful human beings. I
Right,
mean,
right.
humans are called by the horses Yahoos, which of course has entered the language as a
Yeah.
pejorative term. But the first thing Swift does is he picks on the lawyers. They're the worst. Judges are picked from the most dexterous lawyers, he says, who have grown old or lazy, having been biased all their life against truth or equity, or under such a fatal necessity of favouring fraud, perjury,
Wow.
I was shocked. No wonder he got booted out of England. Or about lawyers, it is a maxim among lawyers that whatever, and this is about precedent, he didn't like it very much, whatever had been done before may legally be done again. Therefore, they take special care to record all the decisions formerly made against common justice and the general reason of mankind. These under the name of precedent, it produces authorities to justify the most iniquitous opinions.
Yeah.
And then about my profession, barristers,
Mm.
he calls us, I think, a society of men. I often wonder if he invented this, proving by words that white is black and black is
According
white.
to as much they're
Of
paid.
course. Yeah, but the other bit at the end, and the rest of the world to them are slaves.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that's a point that's in Dickens, and it's a point that's there in Dr. Johnson as well. I mean, it is a particularly commercial lawyers
Yeah, yeah.
and their use of evasions and getting away with as much as they can.
Yes.
Tax breaks for multinationals, creative legal accounting, all of that stuff is, the whole banking scandals, misrepresentations of the bank. Where did all the money go in 2008 to Cayman Island bank accounts, the strategical processes that are NAMA and
Mm,
so on?
mm,
How much of, and of course, Dickens captures this perfectly in Bleak Cast, doesn't he? I mean,
mhm.
above all else, at the end of that suit, the lawyer's getting rich. That's it. And of course, Swift argues for the purpose of law being about justice and merit. He doesn't think we do it. Lawyers are practiced from the cradle in defending falsehood, he said, not justice.
You know, Dickens, he got obsessed in the 19th century with a case of exploration where, a whole Arctic expedition was completely lost. The wife of one of the captains spent her whole life trying to convince Victorians that they should mount another expedition to go find them. And then when finally they got some evidence from basically Inuit who said, no, sorry, these people were stuck on the ice and they resorted to cannibalism. Dickens insisted that you couldn't trust them because they were savages. It reminds me of these books, these earlier, more Renaissance works. I think you're going to talk about Voltaire, and we spoke of
Oh, yeah.
Swift. And of course, they use this age of exploration as a kind of irresistible means of creating allegory. When Gulliver goes across the sea, or when Voltaire has his people, like maybe Micromegas, and they go off to
Yeah, yeah,
explore
yeah,
planets,
yeah.
other places, or an invented version of China.
But it's a parable-driven commentary of their time. That's the
Yeah,
point about it.
yeah, and they're
That
keen
Gulliver
to shove this in the faces of people who want to believe in lawless savages, but what might be more anxiety creating is that people obey a different law, have another system and things like this. And
Gulliver is an extended satire on British life and mores.
yeah,
It
yeah,
really is.
yeah, yeah.
And I mean, the other thing, last quote is laws are like cobwebs, which is true today, absolutely, which may catch small flies, but let wasps and hornets break through. Those who are at the top of companies and
Yeah.
multinational organizations, they get other people to take the hit for them and they leave no trace. And he is the most precise writer of that time. He's one of the most precise writers who's ever lived. And Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal have him at his best. But I think he was the prince of journalists, as Michael Foote called him. There's no question Swift's the greatest journalist who's ever lived. In terms of his seismic impact, even what you might call minor works, Tales of the Tub, they're far from minor.
Mm.
And whether he was an Irishman, he certainly, when he got exiled as Dean of St. Patrick's, he certainly took up the cudgels of Ireland in a hugely patriotic way. And his empathy was always through his life with the little person.
Isn't the modest proposal actually signed by Anonymous?
Yes, and sometimes he played tricks like that.
Yeah,
It is said there's a great poem by Alexander Pope called The Dunciad, which
yeah.
is a satire on British society. It's splendid stuff. and it has tremendous things to say about the law, about hypocrisy and official truth, and the way we're run by message managers. But it is said it was written by Swift, by some people. And it's certainly clear that Pope dedicates it to Swift.
Mhm.
Pope, Swift, Johnson, they were all knocking around the same time. Can I speak before we get to Voltaire a little bit about Dr. Johnson?
Go ahead.
I mean, he's an unclassifiable intellect. You know, he's much caricatured in Blackadder and everything like that. He looked like a behemoth of a human being, fat, overweight, at coffee tables all the time. He wasn't a doctor. In fact, he wanted to be a lawyer, but they wouldn't admit him because he didn't have a degree.
You couldn't.
But the odd thing is that there's a set of chambers, very famous set of chambers named after him, Dr. Johnson's buildings.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the beginning of human rights work in Britain because that set of chambers was set up by the aforementioned Geoffrey Robertson with Helena Kennedy and the late Louis Blum Cooper.
Okay.
D- Oh, yeah. Johnson was obsessed by the law. Uh, and he was it's highly pragmatic
Mm.
if you go to, and of course all of this is recorded by his biographer Boswell.
Who was a
Table talk,
barrister.
who was a barrister, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the table talk of Dr. Johnson, what he
Mm.
had to say about this. And he said some extraordinary things, you know, sort of stuff that's very pragmatic. You should never judge your clients. The fact that you think that they're in the wrong is irrelevant. The fact that you display warmth, he says,
Mm.
even if it is fake warmth, is necessary. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that.
Wow. Mm.
The fact that you find something unconvincing is irrelevant to your professional duty. A judge might find it convincing, Johnson says at given points in time. And he has an astute understanding of when a lawyer is required. He says most of it is nonsense. Plodding nonsense, he calls it. Anyone can do it. But there comes a time when it requires that little bit extra. And he understood that. And in order to achieve that little bit extra, you had to plod your way through things. But he didn't like, I mean, yeah, he says two things. He says, yeah, it's in his dictionary that, you know, effectively he draws the distinction between hating lawyers and an individual lawyer. In other words, you can hate the legal profession, but you can like an individual lawyer. And
Mm.
then there's this famous quote of his, which goes, I don't want to speak ill of anybody, but the person is a lawyer. I
Mm.
haven't met him. I don't know who he is,
Mhm.
but the person is a lawyer. So he didn't necessarily disagree with Swift's assessment of us as money grubbing. And both in him and in Swift and in Shakespeare, there's extensive talk in Shakespeare also of lawyers doing anything or fees. And he also says quite specifically exactly what Swift says, that and this is totally true of the commercial law caste of Ireland, to the rest of the lawyers perceive themselves as a caste and the rest of the country to them are slaves. Which brings us to the great figure himself, Voltaire. There is no doubt, I think, Voltaire is the founder spiritually of the innocence.
Mhm.
He's the founder of the concept of miscarriages of justice. I don't think there's any question about that. And he put himself at huge personal risk for his lobbying for miscarriage of justice. Now, it
Mhm.
began in a personal kind of way. This man was ultimately horrifically tortured and executed, de Barras. But when they burnt him, they burnt Voltaire's dictionary. And the reason they arrested him was that they found he had obscene and pornographic works. He was also being sacrilegious and irreligious during a religious ceremony, or it is said. And when the cops went in
Mhm.
their search and seizure of the time, they found Voltaire's famous dictionary. Of course, Dr. Johnson also had a famous dictionary, and this was crucial to the Enlightenment project. But Voltaire's felt a great sense of personal insult and threat. No, Voltaire had been imprisoned, basically hopscotched out of France to his little, well, it became a huge estate
In England.
on the Swiss border.
Oh, the Swiss
Sorry?
border, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just over the border,
Okay.
Mexico way, as you might say. You know, I mean, he really had annoyed them quite a lot. And he had been in prison. And that wasn't his only escape. he met Swift and Johnson et al. When he had to exile himself in London for a couple of years, which led to the famous quote about the English that they have lots of food but only one sauce, which caused consternation at the time. And he was also a great wordsmith. But crucially, the achievement is about miscarriage of justice. And Voltaire is the first person to say that it is better that a guilty man is defended than
Mm.
an innocent man convicted. He's the first person to nail his colours to the mast. And there's nothing superficial about this. Before the Barras is executed, Voltaire spends enormous amounts of time lobbying, petitioning, that he be acquitted or that he be pardoned. Le Barre, I should say. Even though he was ultimately in 1766 tortured and beheaded, and his body burnt in a pyre with Voltaire's dictionary. It's absolutely shocking
One of
stuff.
those.
And then Voltaire thereafter wrote, because he'd been tortured, wrote a condemnation of torture, which I've read in English translation. And it's every bit as good and great as Camus' Reflections on a Guillotine, which we mentioned in the first article. He had powerful friends. That's why he survived. Friends in the judiciary, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great in Russia, and he lobbied them. Thereafter, of course, there were other. He managed to get, I mean, this is why he's crucial to the Innocence Project, and where I feel a degree of empathy, in a subsequent miscarriage of justice case called Le Barre case. Even though Le Barre was executed, he managed to get him a posthumous pardon, lobbying all the way through for it. And he wrote a crucial text, which in French is Prix de la Justice et de Humanity, which is, or there's the other one called Le Cri du Sang, the cry of innocent blood.
Yeah.
And both of those they're written in the epistolary form, letters and so forth, to lobby for that pardon. And it was very brave of him, both in Le Barre, those were in the context of Barre, and in the posthumous pardon that he subsequently found in the Calais affair, somebody who was tortured again to death for religious obscenity or religious beliefs. Voltaire believed in the Calais case was that it was a fabrication of anti-Catholic fanaticism
Mhm. Mhm.
and that it had nothing to do with reality and that the alleged victim had committed suicide because of gambling debts. Afterwards, Louis XV, who had a rocky relationship with Voltaire, but friendly,
Mm.
hired the chief magistrate of Toulouse, and in 1765, Calais was posthumously exonerated. Now, you might say, what's the point of that? Well, I had the Gleeson case, and the entire family in the Harry Gleeson case felt a huge sense, because his grandchildren,
Mhm.
grandnephews, and
Mm.
so on, absolution and of the proper thing being done, because we live
Yeah.
on in people's memories. So it was extraordinary stuff. Atonement would be a good word for it as well. And that wasn't the end of it. There was also the Comte de Lally. He achieved a posthumous pardon for with the phrase, because he's parked in this estate in the Swiss border, and the Swiss had a up and down relationship. It wasn't state. He built a model town, a village, and he treated his workers brilliantly.
Mm.
But one Swiss functionary came up to him and said to him, "You're supposed to be an atheist or something like this. You attack Christianity all the time. But you do nothing but good things, Mr. Voltaire. You are nothing but doing the work of a Christian."
Do you think
And
he,
that's why he's fascinating.
would he have been entirely against the death penalty? Or
Oh, I would have thought so.
I was struck also your mentions of the famous cases of torture and things,
Yeah, I know he was totally against
and the
torture.
great appearance in the start of Foucault's book Crime and Punishment. Whatever else to say about Foucault, he was very good at spectacle on the page. So that book starts with this, what he would dream, a last medieval public execution where the guy who
Oh,
tries to
it's
execute
shocking.
the king
I've read
has to
that.
be ripped
Yeah,
to pieces. And the notion that
yeah.
that is the effective, delivery of justice and all that, and then the Enlightenment has to erase it. But then you're also reminded that the guillotine was kind of invented as a utilitarian, kind alternative that you would bypass, a thing like torture and get the deed done more quickly and without any slippage.
confessions under torture are unreliable confessions, which was a point Voltaire made. I mean, it's a good point. Would he have been against the death penalty? I mean, there was acceptance of the focus of the attack was in torture and fabrication and false convictions, but
Yeah.
that is exactly the impetus behind the guillotine. But I don't think there's anything cleansing about it. And certainly, if you look at the history of the terror, which Voltaire narrowly avoided,
Yes.
almost everybody could have been or was guillotined. And it was a shocking, grotesque spectacle, but certainly the forms of punishment as Foucault outlines. And I must say, I'm a huge fan of Foucault. A lot of people criticize, he's the only structuralist I think the books are wonderful. Age of Madness, particularly, or the History of Madness, I should say, and those understandings of torture and control. So it's very relevant to this day and age. One of the things I think people unfairly criticize him is their perception of his personal life, which is a criticism of Voltaire as well. You know,
Mhm.
people never seem to be able in this personalized age to draw out the distinction between the man and the work, you know?
Mm.
And Voltaire was a little bit of a libertine, as indeed at a different way was Foucault. But unlike Foucault, I think Voltaire was largely a very good man.
Yeah.
I won't
Yeah.
leave any discussion about him without his famous last line. The whole thing of it is incredible. At the beginning of the French Revolution, he's invited back to Paris, you know, and he's been the great playwright, the great intellect, the father of the Enlightenment. We've only been focusing on the miscarriage of justice stuff. The author of Candide, one of the great works of French literature, or indeed Zadig, or the one you mentioned earlier about aliens. And
Yeah.
what's it called? Micromegas, isn't it?
Micromegas.
Yeah, that I've read as well, and they invite him back for glorious weeks of festivities,
Yeah.
and the old man at this stage is ancient, and it topples him, it kills him, and he dies just before the absolute crumbling of the entire Ancien regime, and certainly before the terror. I think he'd have reacted
Oh,
to the
wow. He
guillotine and the
actually died of
terror.
the pleasure. He died of the liberating of Paris, liberating the wine cellar.
Yeah, no, it just had too much. I mean, he was over 80, wasn't he? He was almost 90, I think. But is it him, famously, on his deathbed? And remember, his reputation was as a that is why he got jailed, anti-clericist as well as anti-monarchist, defender of the little man,
Yep.
hater of superstition, spreader of reason. Is it true? I think it's quote to him, I think it is him, when the Jesuit priest comes up to him, knowing that he is under a settled expectation of death and says, "Do you want me to take your
Mm.
confession?"
Mm.
And Voltaire famously says, this, "Yes, why not? This is no time to be making new enemies."
Oh, yeah.
I'm never quite sure if that was him or Talleyrand. It could have been either of them, but
Mm.
Talleyrand had been an archbishop during the French Revolution. I think
Yeah.
it was
He's
Voltaire, wasn't
the best side switcher of all is Talleyrand.
so.
He's the best side switcher and
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he invents everything one hates about diplomats. He's the greatest diplomat ever, you know? He's he's even or he's like the guy in Yes Minster. It's, you know,
Hmm.
everyone else, he's like the Irish controlled by the civil servants. Regimes come and go. Talleyrand doesn't. He fucks off to America during the height of the terror as
Exactly.
ambassador in the
Exactly.
engineer thing, and then comes back to serve Napoleon. Then when Napoleon's gone, he's back in again. And
Yeah.
then I think doesn't he end up with Napoleon III, the successor?
He makes it a really long way and he makes it to an old age. I know that much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, but by constantly, as you say, switching sides.
Mm.
But what I thought a good thing about ending with Voltaire is that if you end with Voltaire, we're in a situation where you're ending at the period of time of the 19th century, but also it's a prelude to the third podcast, which is on miscarriages of justice.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it seems like a good point to end. Just one thing, I have skipped the Puritans, but that's because within miscarriages of justice, I want to talk about witches and The Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne, which is a 19th century novel, as well as, of course, Victor Hugo's Jean Valjean. And I think we should explore themes of the Innocence Project as well. And not least the works of Mr. John Grisham. Okay, thank you for having me.
Till next time.